Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel of the Continuing Church of God. I want to talk about the Exodus. Was there an Exodus? And if so, when would it have occurred? Many archaeologists, Egyptologists, and secular scholars deny the account of the Exodus. They deny that the children of Israel were in Egypt, that they left, etc. They don't believe that you should believe this, and they teach people that. I went over to Wikipedia a couple of days ago, and I'd like to read what it has. And one of the reasons I want to go there is places like Google, when you do a search, they make Wikipedia results come up first because that's supposed to be unbiased, not supposed to have a point of view. And certain other apps around the world, I've heard, for cell phones, etc., are to make information more accessible to poorer people, bring up Wikipedia because they try to act like it's a reliable source. And sadly, it's not. It's got some things that are okay, don't get me wrong, but some of the stuff shows a definite bias against the facts, against the truth, against the Bible. And understand that it's not just Wikipedia. Other people teach the same stuff. But I wanted to read this from Wikipedia because it's the most accessed, probably, encyclopedia right now. The Exodus is the founding myth of the Israelites. The consensus of modern scholars is that the Bible does not give an accurate account of the origin of the Israelites, who appear instead to have formed as an entity in the central highlands of Canaan in the late 2nd millennium BCE, from the indigenous Canaanite culture. Most scholars believe that the story of the Exodus has some historical core, but the Bible was never intended primarily as a historical document and contains little that is accurate or reliable. Read this again. The Bible was never intended primarily as a historical document. Well, that's accurate, even though it is a historical document, and contains little that is accurate or reliable. That is not true. The majority of scholars nevertheless believe the Exodus has some historical basis. So some scholars say it was totally made up, and some say, well, there was probably something happened. The majority position is the biblical Exodus narrative has some historical core, although its details have been clouded and obscured over time, and that there's little of historical worth in the current biblical narrative. So they're telling you, do not believe this, you can't rely on this book, at least when it comes to the Exodus. And if you read other articles at Wikipedia, they're going to tell you not to rely on this book and a bunch of other things as well. Continuing with Wikipedia. The earliest traces of the tradition behind the Exodus appear to be in the northern prophets, Amos possibly, and Hosea certainly, both active in the 8th century BCE in northern Israel. But their southern contemporaries, Isaiah and Micah, show no knowledge of an Exodus. The Exodus has no historical basis. That's what they said. The Exodus has no historical basis. Now, just because the book of Isaiah or the book of Micah doesn't mention the Exodus doesn't mean they didn't know about it. The Micah book is very small. And I do a lot of writing. Many of you know I have 3 posts a day or more at the cogwriter.com website. I write some books. Matter of fact, here's a whole bunch of them. Church books that I've written. And if I write a couple articles, even 1,000 articles, I may have 1,000 that I don't mention Exodus at all. I could write 1,000 in a row. It doesn't mean I don't believe in Exodus, but this is the kind of misinformation they're saying. There's a saying within archaeology, which is, absence of evidence does not prove evidence of absence. So they're saying because Isaiah and Micah didn't mention it, there's really no reason to believe such things. Plus, they don't believe there's anything in there anyway. So remember, they say Exodus has no historical basis. They don't want you to think that there's any opportunity, there's any debate. No historical basis. Here's something else from Wikipedia. Now, this is from a little earlier. No historical basis for the biblical Exodus story exists. There is no indication that the Israelites ever lived in ancient Egypt, and the Sinai Peninsula shows almost no sign of any occupation for the entire second millennium BCE. Now, many of the things that Wikipedia put there is false. Now, part of the reason, and it's not all the reason, but part of the reason for the denial by Wikipedia and other secular sources is they often hold that the Exodus happened in a century it did not happen. But when they use things like, there's no indication, or Exodus has no historical basis, that's either an outright lie or deliberate ignorance about the Exodus and certain historical matters. What they should say, if they don't believe in the Exodus, is that there are some proofs people point to they don't accept. They could say that. But no, they're saying, no, not at all. And this is one of the lies the anti-Bible types tell themselves all the time. That they're totally right, the Bible's got to be wrong, and don't even consider that it's a possibility the Bible could be right. Anyway, what's happening with Wikipedia is not a new development in the 21st century. In the 20th century, I've got a report here from the old Tomorrow's World magazine, an article called The Exodus from April 1971. They quote a scholar saying, there's no record of any Exodus in the Egyptian records. And they go through this and say that it's just not the case. And it's just a tradition that they did this. And so they didn't accept in the last century, but it's worse in this century. In the last century, there was a bit more debate within scholars. But as I mentioned before, one of the problems that they have is that they go to the wrong date. Now, what's interesting to me is I've read Wikipedia's articles on the Exodus, and they changed them a lot, by the way. Now, that's a good and a bad thing about Wikipedia. The good news is they're willing to change. The bad news is a lot of times they change in the wrong direction, which is actually why I quit writing for Wikipedia, because I wrote for Wikipedia back in the 90s. And even though they claim to have no point of view, even when you put a factual statement there, they would often get removed. Anyway, one of the reasons that with Wikipedia they said Exodus supposedly happened around 1250. They used to cite somebody who was not really any proof as proof that that's what Christians believe, but that's not the case. Myself, other Christians, the late Dr. Herman Hoeh, all pointed to a time, not in the 13th century BC or BCE, which is what 1250 would be, but in the 15th century BC or BCE. One of the reasons, by the way, they use BCE, before the Common Era, Jesus was actually born before Christ. So BC was supposed to have been before Jesus was born and 80 after he came. And they're off a few years on there. Well, anyway, there is evidence that the children of Israel were in Egypt prior to the 15th century. Now, it's true in the 13th century they were not there. They had left. There were some encounters. We'll get to that later. But there are documents in the Egyptian records of some of the things that are recorded in the book of Exodus, even though scholars often and repeatedly say there is no evidence in the Egyptian records of anything like what happened in the book of Exodus. And that's simply not the case. For example, there's something called the Ipuwer Papyrus. Now, Wikipedia used to have information about that regarding the Exodus. Now, at least when I looked this week, they have a link at the bottom somewhere on the page to the Ipuwer Papyrus, but in all the discussion they don't mention it at all. Anyway, the Ipuwer Papyrus, it's I-P-U-W-E-R Papyrus, provides non-biblical evidence that the plagues of Egypt hit the Egyptians, or at least, it sounds a lot like the plagues in the Old Testament. Now, I'll read this from Wikipedia. Ipuwer, a name typical of the period from 1850 to 1450 BCE, The Ipuwer Papyrus has been dated no earlier than the 19th dynasty, around 1250 BCE, but it is now agreed that the text itself is much older. So this part, they have it at least partially right. And they say the Ipuwer was supposed to cover a period from 1850 to 1450 BC. And I would say that it actually covers a period more to 1440, but okay. But places like Wikipedia deny its relevance. And part of the reason we have problems with some scholars on when the Exodus occurred is that they are confused about the Rameses pharaoh. There's a misconception, and this misconception was portrayed in the famous 1956 movie with Charlton Heston, The Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston was Moses in this, and Yul Brynner was supposed to be Pharaoh Ramses. And some other movies have done the same thing, saying, well, Ramses was the pharaoh, and he was the pharaoh from 1279 to 1213. Therefore, the Exodus was in that period of time in the 13th century. Except the Bible doesn't say that Ramses was the pharaoh. Oh, then why did they come up with that? We'll get to that later. And they ignore the fact that the Exodus occurred earlier. It says, we know it didn't occur during the time of Ramses II. Now, I'm not going to read this, but you can go through the book of Genesis, in particular chapter 41, and you can read various things about Joseph going into Egypt, being in Egypt, and the famine in Egypt, and there were 7 years of famine and all that type of a thing. And there's others saying something like that never actually happened, even though it's also repeated in the book of Psalms of 105 verses 16 and 17 also said this happened. And certainly such an event did occur. There is something that might confirm it, and let me explain why I say might in just a minute. It's something called the Famine Stila or Stele, or Joseph's stone. Okay? And it's a message supposedly sent by Zoser, who was a pharaoh of the third dynasty and a ruler of the city of Elephantine. And here's what Zoser allegedly wrote. And I say allegedly because I don't think Zoser wrote it. I was in distress on the great throne, and those who are in the palace were in heart's affliction from a very great evil. Since the Nile, that's the major river in Egypt, had not come in my time for a space of 7 years. What happened in Egypt was the Nile would flood, and flooding brought fertilizer and involves water, and renewed the land so they could farm it. Anyway, continuing, it says, grain was scant, fruits were dried up, and everything which they ate was short. The infant was wailing, the youth was waiting, the heart of the old men was in sorrow. The courtiers were in need, the temples were shut up, the sanctuaries held nothing but air. Everything was found ancient. So this is a report of a 7-year famine that hit Egypt. Now, the famine Stela or Stele, and by the way, I looked up different ways how they use this pronounced, and it was funny. One says Stele, the other say Stele, another say Stella. Anyway, irrespective of how it's pronounced. And I went to a place to say, how do you pronounce this? Oh, that's why I thought that was interesting. Anyway, that this was written on was dates from the 4th to 1st centuries BC. I think they got the name of the pharaoh wrong, because I think it looks like somebody like Senuseret the third at the time. So what am I saying? There's a document, or it's not a document, there's an archaeological artifact called the Famine Stila, that has this stuff inscribed on it, but it was written 1,000 years after the Exodus, and like 1,600 years after Joseph was in Egypt. That's about right. It was by my numbers here. And I think they just got the name of the pharaoh wrong. And I think it was so long after the fact they just got it wrong. Now, some believe that Pharaoh was mentioned in this and that he had a different name. And he was the pharaoh, he was the prime minister, if you will, at the time. So let me read something. And one of the reasons I'm talking some of the stuff about Joseph is, again, remember, the modern scholars tell us there's no evidence that the Semitic Israelites were in Egypt in any of these periods of time. One has got to do, let me read something here from Israel 365 News. Tim Mahoney's drive led him to a 12-year search for evidence the Israelites sojourn in Egypt. The investigation shows that an alphabet showed up in Egypt exactly when I believe Joseph was in Egypt. The early form of writing influenced the message of the Bible. Here's another thing. And by the way, some have claimed that Joseph was the originator of writing. And Egyptologists over at Yale said Egyptian carvings show an earlier date for the alphabet. One of the complaints people have about the Bible, and the book of Exodus, by the way, is they say Moses could not have written it because there was no writing at the time, or there was no Hebrew at the time. As far as we can tell, there was not ancient Hebrew at the time, or Hebrew the way we now know it. But we do believe there was a script that seemed to have been based on hieroglyphics, which was the original alphabet, the one the Yale professor was referring to. And that this is consistent with the fact that a Semitic people was in there. Now, another article regarding that says, who was the first people to use the alphabet? The Semitic people of Egypt, says a fresh discovery. Egyptologists found limestone inscriptions in the desert west of the Nile, probably earliest known of alphabetic writing. When I say alphabetic writing, that means opposed to picture writing. Hieroglyphs were just pictures. Discovery may fix the time and place to the origin of the alphabet. Carved in soft stone in writing in a Semitic script, like Hebrew, or Proto-Hebrew, with Egyptian influences. It's been dated between 1900 and 1800 BC, roughly shortly around the time that Joseph was there. And again, others have said Joseph was the originator. Anyway, this article says it's 2 to 3 centuries earlier than previously thought. The first experiments with the alphabet thus appeared to be work of the Semitics who had lived deep in Egypt and not in their homeland in the Syria-Palestine region. And these are the earliest alphabetic inscriptions, considerably earlier than anyone thought likely. John Coleman Darnell, an Egyptologist at Yale University, told the New York Times. Also, I'd like to read something else. This is about some items that were found near Ramses in Egypt. The non-Egyptian pottery and grave goods are identical with those of the Middle Bronze Age in Palestine. Archaeologically, it's as if the site were actually in Palestine. And this is again referring to the time period when the children of Israel would have been in Egypt. Even though, again, places like Wikipedia try to tell you there's no evidence, there's nothing at all, so it could not have happened. Now, I mentioned Ramses, and the term Ramses or Rameses is mentioned in the Bible several times. 3 are in conjunction with the children of Israel leaving that area, like in Exodus 12:37, Numbers 33. But let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 47. Starting verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. Verse 11. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Rameses, as the Pharaoh had commanded. So this gives the impression, since Genesis comes before Exodus, that Ramses was the name of an area centuries before there was an Exodus. I'm not going to go there, but if you go in the book of Exodus, it talks about there was some Pharaoh who didn't know anything about Joseph. So which obviously way after this. Now, the term Ramses means, according to Wikipedia, Ra is the one who gave birth to him. Now, Ra is an important god to the Egyptians, or was, and because of its location, and that's where the sunrise is perceived elsewhere. It could be, area called Ramses could be perceived to be the child of Ra. And Ra was a god of Egyptians for many centuries. He was their sun god. And he'd become from 2,500 years BC, he'd become a major god in the Egyptian religion, according to this. Now, if you go to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. We read, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass, at the end of 430 years, and that very same day, it came to pass the armies of the Lord went out the land of Egypt." And so we've got, during this time period when the Egyptians were worshiping Ra, children of Israel were over there. As I mentioned in Exodus 1, in verse 8, talks about a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And I guess I'll go down to verse 11 in Exodus chapter 1 here. "Therefore they set taskmasters over the children of Israel to afflict them with burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew." And so we see that this Ramses looks like it was built before Moses was born, because he's not mentioned until the next chapter. It was not until the 19th dynasty of Egypt that the first leader took the name Ramses to himself. He was originally called Pa-ra-masu. Anyway, Ramses first was of non-royal birth, but he was born into a noble military family. Since he wasn't of royal birth, and he started his own dynasty, I think this is one of the reasons why he took the term Ra for the sun god, to show that he was some type of deity or somehow equal with God, or have the type of authority of God, or something along those lines. Now, Ramses I and his son Ramses II are believed to have reigned for 22 and 66 years respectively. And we know that Moses was born after the city of Ramses was built. And Moses was 80 when he went to Pharaoh to ask for the children of Israel to be let free in Exodus 7:7. You don't have to go there. When you add arrange the two Pharaoh Ramses together, it makes it impossible that either was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Simply because the children of Israel left the region called Ramses, it does not mean it had to be named after a 19th dynasty Pharaoh. The pulpit commentary on Genesis 47:11 indicates that the area of Ramses could have existed at the time of Joseph, but it was later fortified by the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt. Now, as far as when was the Exodus, as far as the Bible tells us, well, one indication you can go to is 1 Kings 6, verse 1. So why don't you go there? 1 Kings 6, verse 1. "And it came to pass, in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord." So from 1 Kings 6:1, we see it's 480 years from the Exodus from Egypt to the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Again, another reference to the Exodus. Okay, so it's not just the book of Exodus that has Exodus. You see this in Kings, Psalms, and various passages in the New Testament. And if you know when Solomon's reign began, you can figure out when the Exodus was, but basically by backdating it, and it's going to point to 1446 BC. Various references say that Solomon reigned from 970 BC. You got to take 4 years from that, because you go backwards when it's BC. So you get 4 years from that takes you 966. Now, of course, not all scholars agree that it was 970, but they're all pretty much pointing to a period of time pretty close to that, and pretty much none of them, no scholar I'm aware of, thinks that Solomon reigned a period of time that would make 1250 work out. Okay, it just doesn't. So the false date that the Wikipedia crowd and many believe, that the Exodus allegedly was in 1250, doesn't tie in with the evidence, doesn't tie in with the Bible. The Bible says it couldn't be then. So they say, well, it didn't happen in the 13th century. Of course it didn't happen in the 13th century, because there's no evidence it happened in the 13th century. It didn't happen at all. No. If they would believe the Bible instead of saying the Bible was historically inaccurate or not historically accurate, they would realize, wait a second, it's got to be pointing to sometime in the 15th century BC for the Exodus. And then if they would bother to look there, they could find more information out about it. And Ryer's Study Bible, by the way, basically points to the same thing. He says you look at scriptural evidence in 1 Kings 6. It's 480 years before the 4th year of Solomon's reign. That places it, says, around 1445 BC, or as we're saying 1446. And then there's other writings about in Judges that point to sometime around in the 1400s, etc. So I'm not going to go any more in that. And now, some have pointed to other dates as well, but I want to read about something called the Brooklyn Papyrus. It says the most important text recounts the efforts of a 13th dynasty Theban noblewoman named Senebtisi to establish legal ownership of 95 household servants, whose names indicate that 45 of them were of Asiatic origin. Now, when we tend to think of people of Asiatic origin, we tend to think of people such as the Indonesians or the Chinese or the Japanese, Koreans, etc. But when they're taught Asiatic origin from Egypt, they're talking about people from the Near East or the Middle East, which we would consider, for example, the children of Israel. And it says the presence of so many foreigners in single households suggests Asiatic population was increasing rapidly in the 13th dynasty of Egypt. And that dynasty was from 1809 to 1743 BCE, which is when they started to, they were doing more and more, having more and more Israelites in there. So I mentioned about this Brooklyn Papyrus. It says the Brooklyn Papyrus contains a list of 95 servants. Many are specified as being Asiatic or coming from Western Asia, Canaan. The servants with foreign names are given Egyptian names, just as Joseph was when he became a household servant under Potiphar. The majority of the names are feminine because domestic servants were typically female, while the male servants tend to work in construction or agricultural tasks. Approximately 30 of the servants have names identified with the Semitic language family. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Remember, they said there's no indication children of Israel were there. Semites were over there. But there is. But they don't have to agree with it, but it's wrong for them to go out and say there was no evidence or no indication. They should say that they don't agree that it's conclusive if they don't agree with it. But they want to give this false impression that there's no way you can believe the Exodus. There's no way you can believe the Bible. They want you to think it's not possible. And only the most ignorant, uneducated people would believe the Bible. As a person who's fairly educated by the world standards, I will tell you that no, you don't have to have a doctorate or multiple doctorates to know the truth. Jesus said you know the truth and truth will set you free. He's talking about telling people who are relatively uneducated. And he also said his word was truth. And his word is truth. Don't fall for lies of false scholars, even if there's lots of them who say the same nonsense. I'll digress for a moment. We have a booklet. Is God's existence logical? All right? And this basically explains why the evolutionary view of life coming and the origin of the universe from the evolutionist types is flat out wrong. It's inconsistent with true science. Yes, but all the universities, all the great universities, and the great men and women of science believe in this trash. It is trash, by the way. At the back of this book, I have a quote, and the quote is in the book, and I've quoted this before. I want to read something from Nobel Prize winner Dr. George Wald from Harvard University. Here's what he said. The reasonable view was to believe in spontaneous generation, life from nothing. The only alternative is to believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation. There is no third position. So I think he's right about that. There's only two possibilities. Either somehow everything came from nothing, or there was a supernatural creation. Those are the only two options. Then he says, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Well, if that's impossible, then what's the only other alternative? A supernatural creation. And that's what he should have concluded. But that's not what he did. He said, yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. So he ignores science. Let me assure you, many archaeologists and people at Wikipedia and Facebook and various other censors of the truth don't believe in the truth. And many so-called fact checkers out there on the internet get it wrong as well, because they have an agenda. Whose agenda? Satan's agenda, not God's agenda. Satan is called the god of this world or god of this age. And they listen to him. They don't know that they're listening to him, but that's what they're doing because they overlook the truth. Anyway, I'm not going to go through everything I've got on this, but I've got an article at the cogwriter.com website. When was the Exodus? And did it happen? cogwriter.com website. Goes in a lot more depth on names, etc. Also, back around 1900 BC, there was one called Nefertiti, not to be confused with Nefertiti, who's complaining that these Asiatics had infiltrated the delta. They had come in there. And we have evidence that children of Israel were in Egypt. There's also colorfully dressed Bedouins identified as 37 Asiatics who asked for permission to enter Egypt in 19th century wall painting. And it said these Asiatics and foreigners came to Egypt to graze and water their livestock. And we know that the children of Israel, the literal Israel and his children, came with their flocks and herds into Egypt to water their livestock. There is evidence that the children of Israel were in Egypt by the time of the Exodus. But you've got scholars who tell you there is no evidence. And again, if they were truly interested in the truth, I can understand, by the way, how some can look at certain evidence and come to different conclusions. Okay? We have that happen sometimes with Scripture, particularly in certain things that may not be as clear. We have this happen a lot of times if somebody is a witness to an event, whether it's a crime or something else. People don't always see things exactly the same way. But it's one thing to have a difference of opinion on what the facts mean. But it's quite another to say there are no facts when there are. And places such as Wikipedia should know better. And there's also evidence that the children of Israel left Egypt and were in the time of Canaan earlier than the reign of Rameses. there is the name Israel on something called the Berlin Statue Pedestal Relief, which is from 1350 BC, which is about 100 years after the children of Israel left Egypt. And it was purchased in 1913, but was undiscovered. It was laying around in the Berlin Museum until somebody published a paper about it in 2001. Then in 2010, some other scholars did more study of it. In 2012, they did some 3D scans and all that stuff. It said the name does say Israel. The fragment dates from 1350 to 1213. And it's a granite block that this is on, and so they've demonstrated that. And there's also more evidence. In his book, Dr. Doug Petrovich's book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, he ties together Hebrew letters and Egyptian hieroglyphics. He goes to that in great depth. He found some things he found written that point to Moses, where they spell M-O-S-H-E, which is the way I've seen it spelled in some other languages. Moses is actually Moshe in Hebrew, so that's how it tends to be spelled. But people overlook that. The Apostle Paul warned in Romans 1:22, you don't have to go there, about those who professing to be wise, they become fools. Now in 1983, the late Worldwide Church of God scholar Dr. Herman Hoeh, who I slightly knew, a little bit, he felt that the Exodus date was 1443, and it was during the reign of Amenhotup II, who reigned jointly for 2.5 years with Thutmose III, and the daughter of Thutmose I, whose pharaoh was called Hatshepsut, and that she's the one who adopted Moses. And now later he changed on that a little bit. In 1997, he changed his perspective, and I'm not going to go through all the details that he gave here, but basically he concluded that the Exodus would have been 1446, and he also includes this based upon work by Edwin Thiel, which is kind of interesting because that's an alternative spelling of my last name. It's Thiele. But anyway, I've seen that when I've done studies about my name, derivation, that name pops up as one of the ones that came from it. Let's see, Dr. Petrovich also points to 1446 or 1445 BCE for the time of the Exodus. Now let's go to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 13. I'm going to read several scriptures, so you might want to start to follow me on these. And one of the reasons I want to do this is that the New Testament confirms the idea that the Exodus did happen. Okay, Acts 13, verse 16, Paul stood up, motioned with his hand, said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. With an uplifted arm, he brought them out. Now for a time was about 40 years, he put up with their ways in the wilderness." Now let's go to the book of Hebrews. And the next several passages I'm going to read are from Hebrews. We're going to read Hebrews 3. We'll start in verse 16. "For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness?" Hebrews 8:9. "Not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. Because they did not continue with my covenant, I disregarded them." Now let's go to Hebrews 11. Read a few verses starting at verse 24. "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. And hopefully you're looking to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempted to do so were drowned. And also, I'm going to read from Jude, a couple of verses, 5 and 6. Jude wrote, I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Hopefully you are one who believes. As far as the time period goes, let's go to the book of Acts chapter 7. It's a little complicated, but let me go from this. Acts 7, starting verse 17. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who didn't know Joseph, as we read in Exodus 1. This man dealt treacherously with our people, oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so they might not live. At this time Moses was born, well pleasing to God. He was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. And we set out. Pharaoh's daughter took him, brought him to be her own son. And Moses learned all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was mighty in word and deeds. Which is one of the reasons why, by the way, you say Moses wrote what we say he wrote in the Bible. Jesus said Moses wrote part of the Bible. And we go into that in depth from a book we have. It's online, Who Gave the World the Bible. This booklet, this one and any other one I might hold up, by the way, are available free at the www.ccog.org website. ccog.org. CCOG standing for Continuing Church of God. Go ccog.org website. So Moses could have written because he was trained in Pharaoh's household. Now, verse 23. When he was 40 years old, he came to visit his brethren. So, see one of them suffering wrong, he defended and avenged him, struck down the Egyptian. He thought his brethren would have understood that God would deliver him, but they didn't understand. And throughout history, people have not accepted God's prophets. The next day he appeared to them, were fighting. Your brethren, why are you wronging another? But the one who did the neighbor wrong said, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday? So at this saying, Moses became dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. So Moses is 40 at the time. And then in Exodus 7:7, we find that Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. So we see that Moses was in Midian for 40 years. Now, according to certain readings, there's an inscription on something called the Amenhotup Stele, MERNEPH. No, let me read that again. MERNEPTAH Stele, STLE. It shows that the Israelites already occupied the land of Canaan during 1213 to 1203 BC, which is the reign of MERNEPTAH. Not sure why I can't say that. That stele was discovered in 1896. It talks about a battle and shows people dressed like Canaanites. It tells us Egypt destroying the seed of Israel. And this basically means the idea that Exodus appeared during the time of Rameses is impossible. Why? Because Rameses II allegedly reigned until 1213, and the children of Israel is shown in the Bible to have wandered for 40 years in the wilderness before settling on the land of Canaan. It would make no sense that the defeated Rameses II could have reigned at least 30 years, 40 years minus the 10 for the reign of MERNEPTAH, after experiencing the plagues and loss of armies that he had. Now, Jewish sources say that there's some evidence of that Joseph was given a different, that Moses was given a different name in some of the writings, and that there's non-Jewish accounts were plainly inspired by hatred of the Jews and display a strange mixture of blurred biblical facts and free fiction. And that's one of the problems that we've had. So you have people who don't want to know the Bible, so they'll pick and choose a few parts of the Bible and then say this stuff is not true. Now, in my article, I have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things about trying to explain who the pharaoh was of the time of Moses. And basically, we've concluded, and this is what Dr. Hoeh concluded, and scholars who seem to hold the Bible in respect, they may not agree with all of it, but who tend to respect the Bible, have concluded that it looks like it was Amenhotup II who would have been the pharaoh during that time. And one of the reasons is that some things happened during his reign. Somehow there was a radical change in his foreign policy. And there was some type of religious crisis that happened. So let me read something about this. They're tying this back to archaeologist Dr. Douglas Petrovich, University of Toronto. He explores the precise timing of the abandonment of the ancient Egyptian city of Avaris during the Egyptian 18th dynasty. In the article, Petrovich explores the various theories about the exact time of the abandonment of the city of Avaris, which seems to coincide with the reign of Amenhotup II. The significance of this is possible relevance to the Exodus is that it's indirect evidence of a major crisis event which happened in the 9th year of Amenhotep's reign. That event could very well have been the Exodus. And here's some things from Petrovich. More inscriptional evidence may attest directly to the year 9 crisis in Amenhotep II's commissioning of a decree for his couriers to destroy all the images of the gods, singling out Amun-Re in particular. Given that Thutmose III and Amenhotep II expressly ascribed praise to Amun-Re for military victories on their Asiatic campaigns, and that Amenhotep originated or perpetuated the desecration of Hatshepsut's images throughout Egypt, and Hatshepsut was Moses' the Egyptian princess who adopted Moses. He claimed to be his mother. There's plenty of reason to hypothesize that the religious crisis and subsequent decree to destroy all the bodies of Egypt's deities through the land may be intricately bound to the military and political turmoil of his year 9. Moreover, potential interruption of the high priesthood of Amun during this time may also attest to this perfect storm of events. Therefore, religious crisis focused on Amun-Re at the time may have been initiated by Amenhotep II as a result of his devastating loss in battle, which coincided with the abandonment of their principal naval base from which military operations from Asia were launched and led to an unavoidable shift in foreign policy. Basically, what happened from a biblical perspective, presuming Amenhotep II was the pharaoh, is the Plagueis of Egypt. And we have sermons that we've done on this that you can find at this channel, where we go through and show a couple things about those plagues. One is that they are connected to various Egyptian deities. God was showing the Egyptians, and the Israelites for that matter, that the gods of Egypt were of no value. And various plagues were against this god or multiple gods or goddesses that the Egyptians had. Well, this caused a massive crisis in Egypt and would explain why Amenhotep would have destroyed a bunch of the idols of these gods because they didn't protect them. And because didn't like what happened with Moses, the adopted mother of one of his relatives, which destroyed everything associated with her he could as well. So that's totally consistent with what happened. Let me read something from another article, one of the many articles I have here. This is part of my article. This is from Petrovich. It says, God told Moses he would harden Pharaoh's heart and the Pharaoh would refuse to free the Israelites. God instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh, this is from Exodus 4, Thus says the Lord, Israel is my my son, my firstborn, but you've refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. After the ninth plague, God repeated this prediction in Exodus 11:5. And he goes through and he has evidence to describe who this was, and he suspects it was an unattested Tutmos, somebody called Tutmos, one of the Tutmoses. And he gives lots and lots of information about this. Basically, he concludes that there are lots of evidence that coincides with what the Bible teaches. Now, biblically, so there's something also called the dream stele, which also talks about essentially the death of a son, etc., of a pharaoh. And in Exodus 12:29, we know Pharaoh's son died, because it says in Exodus 12:29, came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, the firstborn of the livestock. Now, when this happened, of course, they wanted the children of Israel gone. If you're in Exodus 12, we're going to go to verse 30. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all the servants, and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one that was dead. Then he, that's this Pharaoh, probably Amenhotup, called Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go and serve the Lord as you said. Take your flocks, your herds, which you said, and be gone, and bless me also. Egyptians urged the people they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. Thinking it's God's killed all this stuff, we could be next. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound in their clothes on their shoulder, bound up their clothes on their shoulder. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they'd asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they gave unto them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Rameses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot plus children. Now, there is a record in this Ipuwer Papyrus that I was referring to before that talks about the loss of gold to the Egyptians. Papyrus 3, 6 through 10. Gold is lacking. All the handicrafts is at end. The king's palace is despoiled. Behold, no craftsman works. The enemies of the land have spoiled its crafts. People are stripped of clothes, spices, and oil. Everyone says there is none. Well, that's consistent with the biblical account, but they say there's no evidence. Notice also, if you're in Exodus 12, go down to verse 38. A mixed multitude went up with them also in flocks and herds, and a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes on the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt, could not wait, and they prepared provision for themselves. Now there's another record in the Ipuwer Papyrus. It seems to tell of Egyptians who became foreigners. Those who were Egyptians have become foreigners, is actually what it quotes. So the children of Israel were sort of considered to be Egyptians because they were in that Egypt for hundreds of years, but they became foreigners. Here's something else in Ipuwer Papyrus. Indeed, every dead person is a well-born man. Those who were Egyptians have become foreigners and are thrust aside. Yeah, the Egyptians thrust the Israelites out. And that's in Ipuwer Papyrus. Here's another part from it. This is section, okay, the last one was 4:1. This is from 5:2-3, Ipuwer Papyrus. Indeed, magnets are hungry and perishing. Followers are followed because of the complaints. Indeed, the hot-tempered man says, if I knew where God is, then I would serve him. People were suffering because of the plagues of Egypt. And so some of the mixed multitude, by the way, that went with the children of Israel were probably Egyptian. And so the Egyptians became foreigners. And that's something that we see. Now, as far as written evidence about the Exodus, the following is related to the Greek historian Hecateus of Abdera, and an Egyptian priest and teacher called Charemon, the Roman historian Tacitus, and the Greek historical philosopher Strabo. Says, the author of the earliest non-biblical account of the Exodus is this guy begins with an H, of Abdera, who came to Egypt around 320 BC. In his version, the story begins the moment of distress. A plague is raging Egypt. Egyptians interpret this as divine punishment for the presence of aliens and the introduction of alien rites and customs. Consequently, the aliens are just expelled. Some, under the leadership of Katos and Danos, colonized Greece, while others, under the leadership of Moses, colonized Palestine. Now, according to this Hecateus person, Moses forbade the making of divine images. Well, we know with the Ten Commandments it said don't have images before God. Now we've got this other one. This is at Charemon, an Egyptian. Lived in the first half of the first century. He was a tutor of Nero. He gives another version. He said the goddess Isis appeared to King Amenhotup, which is Amenhotup, by the way, in a dream and reproached him because of the destruction of her temple in the times of war. He advised him to purge Egypt of the lepers, of the foreigners. The king gathered 250,000 lepers and expelled them from Egypt. Their leaders were Moses and Joseph, whose Egyptians' names were Tisitin and Pedestal. So you've got another account. There's 250,000 lepers, well, the Bible says 600,000 men plus others, being purged. And there's also something from Pompeius's, Trogus' Historica Philippi. Here Moses was not an Egyptian, but is called the son of Joseph. Well, he was not quite a son of Joseph, but anyway. And when he leaves Egypt, he took the sacred objects of Egypt, and while trying to recover these objects by force, the Egyptians were forced by storms to return home. Well, you may recall when the children of Israel went through the Red Sea, the army of Pharaoh, the Egyptian army, got destroyed by that same sea. And some people think that there was some kind of weather involved. Oh, God probably has some strong wind blowing for a time and then pushed back together. And then Tacitus gives a summary that combines many aspects of the Exodus tradition. Egypt is struck by an epidemic that leads to bodily deformities. And we read about various things related to that in the plagues. The king consults an oracle that learns he's got to rid his country of this race of people because their gods detest them. The Jews the children of Israel are driven into a desert, but they find a leader in Moses who brings them to Palestine and founds Jerusalem. In order to consolidate his authority, according to this story, Moses institutes a new religion, which is the exact opposite of all the other religions. Tacitus, and as well as these others, characterize the Jewish concept of God as monotheistic and aniconic. Aniconic means against idols and images. Tacitus writes, the Egyptians worship many animals and monstrous images. The Jews conceive of one God, and with that of the mind only. They regard those who make representations of God in man's image from perishable materials as impious. That supreme and eternal being is incapable of being representation and is without end. Now, according to Strabo, there was an Egyptian priest named Moses. He felt dissatisfied with the Egyptian religion, decided to found a new religion, and he left and took his followers to Palestine. So we see this in many accounts. Now, of course, places like Wikipedia are going to say, well, these came later, after the children of Israel made all this stuff up. But things like the Ipuwer Papyrus did not. They were there beforehand. And there's more things here. This is says that another account, an Egyptian priest in Moses, he declared the Egyptians and the Africans entertained erroneous representations of the divinity because they used the likeness of wild beasts and cattle. And the Greeks were making errors with having their images as well. And he had people follow him. And of course, the reality is the true Christian religion, the true biblical religion, is the opposite of Satan's religions, including those that were in Egypt. The true biblical religion is based on truth and love and the give way of life, not lust and not on idols. And there's a tomb that talks about Egyptians being drowned. It says the 10th hour of the Amenhotup depicting the deified drowned in the lower register in the tomb of Amenhotup II. So we see there's something about drowned people associated with Amenhotup. And remember, when the Egyptians went after the children of Israel through the Red Sea, they drowned. And here's something from a book called Was There an Exodus and Conquest? If the dating of archaeological sites should be based on pottery and other historical considerations, such as the chronology of Egyptian pharaohs, then all the evidence from the Tel Jericho, that's a site in Jericho, argues for its destruction and burning around 1401 to 1406 BC. All the evidence from Jericho at this time fits the biblical record in an amazing way, from the details about the city being burned along with everything in it, see Joshua 6, to the walls, dwelling places where Rahab held the Jewish spies. Continuing research at Jericho and now new research at Tel Makor, which they believe might be the biblical AI, is yielding results that confirm the biblical record of Joshua's conquest in amazing ways. Most critical scholars place Ai at this El Tel, but there's no evidence of destruction there which fits the biblical description. However, just 1 kilometer west is another site which very well could be the biblical site of Ai. Now, for the Exodus to take place in 1446, which is what I said, then you have 40 years in the wilderness, that would bring it to 1406, which is a likely time of the destruction of Jericho. So it fits. There is all kinds of evidence out there. There's a researcher by the name of John Garstang who excavated the ancient Jericho, and he came to the conclusion its destruction took place around 1400. And understand, when they come up with these dates, it's really tough to be really precise. 1400 is pretty close to 1406, and that's probably when that happened. And he took a team to Israel back in 1930 in order to when he did that. There are others who've also come to a similar conclusion. All right, now there's something else I want to show. Now there's some artifacts that I think might be interesting. Here's something that was a find called the Solab temple inscription. I'm going to show this, and I know it's not going to come out maybe this is most clear, but there it is below my finger here. This hieroglyphic corresponds very precisely to the Hebrew tetragrammaton, YHWH or VH, Yahweh, and antedates its oldest occurrence on the Moabite stone by over 500 years. And so this points this idea of the term of Yahweh being around earlier, because you've got people saying it out of something that was invented later. And Pharaoh Amenhotup III knew about Yahweh, therefore, in 1385 because of this inscription. Okay, and it was his grandfather or father, Amenhotup II. So there is all kinds of evidence out there that the children of Israel were there. Now Josephus wrote a few things. This is the first century Jewish scholar. He talks about Rameses was a king's daughter. She went to the banks of the river, and she's the one now known as Hatshepsut. And talks about this. He finds Moses. She brings him up. Talks about Miriam. And she calls him Moses from what happened. And from the Egyptians call water by the name of Mo. And so when they're saved out of it by the term Usus, put those two together, they came to Moses, according to Josephus. Now, Josephus said that the daughter of Pharaoh was Rameses, which is very similar to the name Tutmos. And if you can go through the details, I'm not going to go through all of them here. I'll refer you back to my paper where I've got a bit more details on some of this stuff. I just don't. It's a lot to read, but to shorten it, there's all kinds of evidence that we know who Pharaoh was during the time of the Exodus. It was not Rameses II. It appears to be Amenhotup II. We know who the princess mother, adopted mother of Moses was. And when you look at it, it again points away from the Rameses II situation. I mentioned stuff about the 10 plagues, and then there's some arguments about the date of the Ipuwer Papyrus, but it was written, Ipuwer Papyrus they think was written in the 13th century, but scholars, overall, biblical and non-biblical scholars, are pretty sure that what happened was way prior to that. Some scholars think that the Ipuwer Papyrus dates from like 2184 BC or the Amenhotup of 1770 BC. But there's all kinds of dates for it. And when we see what happened in the Bible, it seems to correspond pretty close to that document. Now, let me read something that the old Worldwide Church of God wrote about this concerning the Ipuwer Papyrus and the 10 plagues. Now, again, I understand that scholars may differ on the timing of this and the dating of it, but again, the Ipuwer Papyrus, the oldest copy we've got is from the 13th century, and it was for an earlier period. Now, we're saying it's talking about events from the 15th century. And the old Worldwide Church of God had a similar view, and it says, the account of the 10 plagues is what's called the Ipuwer Papyrus. It matches the biblical record in detail. The phrase "all is ruined" occurs at least twice. In Upper Egypt, Pharaoh's servants asked him, "Do you not understand that Egypt is ruined?" So we see that from the scripture. Anyway, as I mentioned, it has a lot of details that align with the plagues of Egypt. And these are Egyptian sources. A lot of these things I'm talking about are Egyptian sources with inscriptions and some steles, etc. Yet you've got scholars like Wikipedia said there's no indication the biblical account's not accurate. They don't want to prove the biblical account accurate. Why? Because it goes against their agenda. They got a different agenda and it's not God's. Anyway, was there an Exodus? Certainly there was an Exodus. Yes, it was documented in the Bible. Now, another odd thing about scholars, if they find writings regarding other peoples that don't come to the Bible, they usually think that they're accurate. Okay? But when it comes to the Bible, they seem to have an opposite view. We can't believe the Bible, can't believe the Bible, can't believe the Bible. Now, on the other hand, there are some biblical archaeologists or various scholars who say, okay, the Bible must be true, therefore let's go out and look for evidence. And that's something that I've tended to do on various things. And you can find stuff if you're looking for it. But a lot of scholars don't want to. They want to prove the opposite. They hold the Bible to a different standard than other archaeological information because they want to believe it's just the founding myth, etc., so the Israelites would believe certain things, and it doesn't have to be true. So yes, there absolutely was an Exodus. The Bible says it. You can rely on that. I would make one other comment here. We've got another book I should hold up here called Proof Jesus is the Messiah. And one of the reasons I hold this up is if you read this book and study it, you'll be able to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. A lot of scholars discount that as well. But the reality is that is true. Jesus absolutely was the Messiah. And you can prove that if you're willing. Which also proves that the Bible is accurate. In my opinion. Anyway, I think the Exodus looks like it was around 1446. As far as various experts and stuff, in 2 Peter 3:3, you don't have to go there. Peter was inspired to write, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts. They don't want to believe in the God of the Bible. They don't want to believe Jesus is the Messiah. They don't want to have to live as Jesus taught. Apostle Paul warned in 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, but know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. Or in the last days, verse 13. Evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Yes, these phony false scholars are deceiving and being deceived. And again, it's not just about the Exodus. It's also got to do with Jesus, origin of the universe, morality, etc. Now that being said, for those of us, there are some who, again, don't believe the Exodus. They got the dates off by a couple of centuries. But understand, the Bible says in Romans 3, verse 4, let God be true and every man a liar. So even if they look like they have facts that contradict the Bible, let me simply say that usually it's because either their fact is not a fact, or what they say the Bible says, the Bible does not say. It's going to be one or the other or some combination. Let me go to 1 Timothy 6, verse 20. I want to read this. Paul warned Timothy, cutting into verse 20, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have strayed concerning the faith. New King James warns about people who say they have knowledge and they don't have it. The Old King James, by the way, says it's science falsely called. Apostle Paul also warned in 2 Timothy 3:7 about people who are always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth because they don't want to come to the knowledge of the truth. They don't want you to believe this book because they don't believe it all. So when you hear opinions of scholars that contradict the Bible, remember the Bible is true. And people say, you're just saying that, and we just have to take it on faith. Well, the Apostle Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, admonishes Christians, admonishes God's people. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. As I mentioned before, you can prove that Jesus is Messiah. You can prove God's existence is logical. You can prove that the only logical explanation is that God created everything. And when it comes to historical events, if someone says it doesn't square with the Bible, it's because they don't understand the Bible or their event is in error. They're not getting it right. Anyway, just because there were pharaohs in the 19th dynasty who were called Rameses doesn't mean the Exodus was in the 19th dynasty in the 13th century BC. Historical evidence points to the Exodus occurring over 3,460 years ago, around 1446 BC. Yes, there was an Exodus. Yes, you can believe the Bible. Don't be misled by so-called scholars who tell you about knowledge falsely called, even if it's in some type of encyclopedia that the mainstream media loves. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.